America is $36 trillion in debt. Say that number out loud and it barely means anything. It's too big to picture. So let's start with the assumption most people make. China holds it all, right? Wrong. China owns around $750 billion of that debt, a slice, not the mountain. And here's the twist nobody mentions. China itself is buried in over $18 trillion of its own debt. So if China isn't the one holding the bag, who is? Nobody. Or rather, everybody. Chinese banks hold American debt. American banks hold debt from China, Europe, Japan. Pull one thread and it connects to 5 others. Every country on Earth is borrowing and every country on Earth is lending. And when you add it all up, the world is sitting on $300 trillion in debt, triple the size of the entire global economy. Stack that in $1 bills and it would reach the moon and back 50 times over. So here's the question that should actually keep you up at night. If the whole world owes this much money, who exactly is getting paid? Debt isn't a modern invention. Long before banks, borrowing was just a neighbor lending a bag of grain in spring and getting paid back at harvest. Maybe a little extra as thanks. No interest rate, no paperwork, just trust. Borrowing from tomorrow to solve a problem today. That's the whole idea at its core. And it hasn't really changed in 5,000 years. Over time, small personal favors turned into something enormous. Kings needed castles, empires needed warships, and no single wealthy lender could cover that. In the 1600s, England hit exactly this wall. King Charles II was gearing up for war with the Dutch, the treasury was empty, and the nobles weren't handing over another shilling. So England tried something new, selling small pieces of government debt directly to the public. Give us cash now, we'll pay you back later with interest. That piece of paper was a bond, and it changed everything, because now a state could raise enormous sums without draining its own treasury or hiking taxes overnight. By the 20th century, bonds had gone global. Both world wars pushed nations to borrow at a scale never seen before, first to fight, then to rebuild. Then in 1944, the Bretton Woods Agreement made the US dollar the anchor of the entire financial system. Currencies tied themselves to the dollar, and the dollar tied itself to gold. But gold is limited, and growing economies are not patient. As American spending climbed, there simply wasn't enough gold to back all the dollars floating around. So in 1971, President Nixon cut the cord entirely. Overnight, money became what we now call fiat currency, backed by no physical asset, only a government's promise. And once a government can create money at will, borrowing stops being a last resort and starts becoming a habit. From the 1980s on, global debt exploded. Nations discovered that borrowing wasn't just for wartime anymore. It could fuel growth itself. So they borrowed to build schools, repair roads, climb out of recessions. Debt quietly shifted from an emergency measure into an everyday economic tool. And the scale of it now is almost impossible to picture. A stack of $1 million $1 bills rises about 100 meters, roughly a 30-story building. $1 billion stacks 100 kilometers high, tall enough to brush the edge of the atmosphere. $300 trillion, the current global total, could stack to the moon and back 50 times. That's not a rounding error. That's the entire modern economy, built on paper promises stacked higher than we can actually see. So who actually holds America's $36 trillion? You'd expect some shadowy external creditor, but roughly 70% of US debt is owed to Americans themselves. Here's how. The government borrows by issuing bonds, a formal promise to repay with interest, the same basic idea as a bank loan. And who buys those bonds? Very likely, indirectly, you. Money you deposit at your bank doesn't just sit in a vault. Banks put it to work, lending it out, investing it, buying government bonds, so they can pass a little interest back to you. Right now, U.S. commercial banks alone hold close to $1.8 trillion in treasury bonds, more than triple the entire economy of a country like Canada. Bonds are popular because they're one of the safest ways to grow spare cash. They don't swing wildly like stocks. But the rate the government offers shifts with the economy. In the 1980s, rates climbed past 15% to fight runaway inflation. During the pandemic recovery, they dropped below 1% to encourage spending. Once you buy a bond, though, your rate locks in. Whatever happens afterward isn't your problem. Right now, a 10-year U.S. bond pays a steady 4.5%. Solid, low risk, boring. Exactly what savers want. And it's not just banks buying in. Pension funds, insurance companies, investment firms, they all do the same thing. In 2024, U.S. pension funds put a quarter of their total assets into bonds. Insurance companies went even further, over 60%. This creates a hidden network where ordinary savings quietly become loan money for the government. So the strange idea of America borrowing from itself isn't strange at all. It's just money flowing from where it's sitting idle to where it's needed. When the government pays interest on its debt, that money flows right back to lenders, who use it to buy more bonds and earn more interest. Around and around it goes. And the same loop plays out between nations. That remaining 30% overseas exists because foreign banks and governments do exactly what domestic ones do: park spare cash in U.S. bonds. Japanese savings become loans for the Dutch. Dutch savings become loans for Brazil. Brazilian savings flow right back into American bonds. It's not a pile of unpaid bills waiting to explode. It's an interconnected web where money loops from savers to borrowers and back again, rarely ever truly leaving the system. So how does anyone actually pay this back? Mostly, they don't. Not really. They borrow new debt to cover the old debt. Reckless as that sounds, it's become the actual foundation the global economy runs on. Debt fuels growth. When a government borrows and spends, that money moves through the economy. Businesses earn, workers get paid, those workers spend more, and the cycle keeps turning. In China, 19% of government spending is borrowed. In the US, it's closer to 25%, roughly 1 in every $4, about what the country spends on education and welfare combined. Stop that borrowing suddenly, and the engine runs in reverse. Greece learned this the hard way. When the 2008 crisis hit, investors panicked and stopped buying Greek bonds. Greece come a borrow, and within a few years, 1 in 4 public workers lost their job, wages fell 30%, and the economy shrank by a quarter. No politician wins an election promising austerity, so borrowing continues, because the alternative is almost always worse. Sometimes it isn't a choice at all, it's survival. When COVID hit in 2020, spending collapsed almost overnight, and governments had no option but to step in and cover the gap. The US alone borrowed $3.8 trillion that single year, nearly a fifth of its entire economy. China, Europe, everyone did the same. Necessity, not preference. But every cycle carries risk underneath it. As debt grows, so does the interest owed on it, and a bigger slice of every budget goes toward paying old loans instead of building anything new. A debt-to-GDP ratio near 100% used to be considered catastrophic. Now it's simply normal. That's fine while lenders stay confident. The moment they don't, borrowing costs spike. One escape hatch governments reach for is printing more money, but that quietly devalues every dollar already out there, and the result is inflation. Prices climb, savings shrink, people feel poor even if nothing in their life actually changed. Venezuela in the late 2010s took that escape hatch too far. The government printed so much money to cover its debts that prices doubled every few weeks. Bread that once cost 10 bolivars suddenly cost millions. Life savings vanished almost overnight. Most countries never fall that far, but even moderate inflation chips away at
Currency's value. Developing nations face an extra trap. They often borrow in foreign currency, like US dollars, as a safeguard. So if their own currency weakens, repaying that debt suddenly gets far more expensive in local terms. Lenders notice, confidence slips, and they start demanding higher interest to compensate for the added risk. And when a government can't borrow enough to cover what's coming due, the choices left are all bad ones. Cut spending, raise taxes, print more money. None of it painless. None of it guaranteed to work. If the money truly runs out, a country defaults, the sovereign version of missing a mortgage payment, except the whole economy is what's at stake. And once you've defaulted, almost nobody wants to lend to you again. When a system built entirely on borrowed confidence starts to feel fragile, people naturally start looking for something they can hold on to that isn't just a promise on paper. That instinct is exactly what's playing out right now. Central banks and investors are quietly buying gold at record rates, searching for something that doesn't depend on a government's ability to pay its debts. Whether that instinct is right or wrong is something each person has to weigh for themselves, but it's a pattern that shows up again and again throughout this whole story. Trust rises, trust falls, and underneath all of it, the endless loop of global debt keeps spinning, borrower to lender, lender to borrower, a system with no real finish line, only the next payment and the next promise. Because in the end, the $300 trillion question was never really who's going to pay this back. It's how long can everyone keep agreeing to believe they will?